One day, it's a strike in central Gaza. The next, it's a war with Iran that's already cost tens of billions. Then it's gas prices at the pump, a high-stakes China trip, and even talk of turning Venezuela into the 51st state. That is not a normal news cycle. That is a government and media environment running at full speed. Today, we're pulling together the big developments that are driving the headlines right now. The latest strike in Gaza, the expanding U.S. confrontation with Iran, the economic hit landing on Americans, Trump's trip to Beijing, and the strange new pressure points in Latin America. And the bigger question underneath all of it is simple. Who is paying for these decisions? Who is benefiting? And how much of the coverage is telling the full story? If you're getting value from this, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. The latest report out of central Gaza says an Israeli strike killed at least one Palestinian man and injured another person near the Nuseirat refugee camp. Medical sources identify the man as Abdulrahman al-Shaafi, and his body was taken to a hospital in Deir al-Balah. That's the immediate story. But the largest story is the one getting buried. According to Gaza's health ministry, this happened during a period that was supposed to be covered by a ceasefire deal, and the ministry says the violence has continued anyway. It claims hundreds of Palestinians have been killed and thousands wounded since the agreement was signed. Now it's worth slowing down here, because the sourcing matters. A lot of these figures come from a ministry inside a territory controlled by Hamas. And that doesn't automatically make every number false, but it does mean you should treat the reporting carefully, especially when some outlets present the numbers with very little context. On the other side, Israeli statements often focus on military necessity and security threats, while giving far less weight to the civilian calls. That leaves the public stuck in the middle, trying to figure out what is actually happening on the ground, and what is just being packaged for political effect. The clearest part is this: whatever the ceasefire is supposed to mean on paper, it is not producing peace in practice. And that matters because the U.S. administration has continued to back Israel while offering very little public criticism, even as aid restrictions and shifting control lines on the ground remain major flashpoints. According to the reporting here, the so-called Yellow Line has been pushed farther west, giving Israel control over a large share of Palestinian territory. That should raise alarm for anyone who still believes ceasefires are supposed to freeze a conflict instead of quietly redrawing the map. And there's another layer to this. The American taxpayer is always told these conflicts are about stability, deterrence, and long-term security. But what you see over and over is a pattern of endless escalation, vague diplomatic language, and civilians paying the price, while the political class in Washington talks in circles. So the Gaza headline is not just a tragedy. It's a reminder that when ceasefires become political theater, people still die anyway. Now zoom out from Gaza to the much larger regional war with Iran, because this is where the financial impact starts hitting ordinary Americans in a very direct way. President Trump said Tuesday that the financial situation for Americans is not really part of his decision-making when it comes to Iran. He basically said it flat out. Not even a little bit. That is a remarkable sentence, and it tells you a lot about how this administration sees the conflict. The message is not, how do we protect the U.S. economy? The message is, the only thing that matters is keeping Iran to having a nuclear weapon. The problem is that the war has already pushed gasoline higher, shaking global trade, and added massive costs for the U.S. military. One live estimate put the cost of the war at $29 billion so far, and that number keeps climbing. And for families in the real world, none of that is abstract. The average gas price in the U.S. has been rising, and the forecasts keep changing upward. That's not a coincidence. When you disrupt shipping lanes, hit oil infrastructure, and keep the Strait of Hormuz under pressure, global energy markets react. They always do. This is where the economic side of foreign policy gets ignored by a lot of the coverage. You'll hear a lot of dramatic language about red lines and historic moments, but not enough about what it means for inflation, commuting, trucking, and the cost of basic goods. Trump is also rejecting Iran's latest peace proposal, calling it unacceptable and accusing Tehran of playing games. Iran, for its part, says it wants an end to the war, an end to sanctions pressure, and relief from the naval blockade. The two sides are still miles apart. And then there's the Axios report that Israel wants Trump to send U.S. special forces to secure Iran's enriched uranium. That is the kind of idea that sounds surgical in a headline and disastrous in real life. Because once you move from airstrikes and sanctions to special operations on the ground, you are no longer flirting with escalation, you are announcing it. Even Israeli leaders are not exactly hiding what they want. Netanyahu has been suggesting that the uranium can be physically removed, and Trump has been saying the U.S. is surveilling the site and would strike anyone who tries to recover it. That is not de-escalation. That is a standoff with a fuse burning down. And from a practical American perspective, this is where the questions should start getting louder. What is the end state? How much money is this costing? What happens if Iran responds by targeting oil assets again? Who absorbs the damage when shipping, insurance, and fuel prices jump? It is easy for politicians to sound tough when the bill gets passed to everyone else. Now Trump is heading to Beijing, and he's saying the focus will be trade, not the Iran war. He's also downplaying the distances with Xi Jinping and predicting that good things are going to happen. That sounds upbeat, but it also exposes the reality of the moment. The U.S. is trying to juggle a Middle East war, a major standoff with China, and domestic economic pressure all at once. That is a lot to manage, especially if you are also trying to reassure voters that fuel prices and inflation are under control. China's role here is interesting. It's being described as an unofficial mediator on Iran, which makes sense because Beijing has leverage, energy interests, and diplomatic channels that Washington doesn't fully control. But let's be honest, the US and China are not natural partners in this, they are strategic competitors. So when Trump says the threat is mostly about trade and that Iran is just part of the conversation, what he's really saying is that the administration is trying to keep multiple fires from turning into one giant regional crisis. And then there's the optics. On one hand, you have a White House projecting strength, saying the blockade on Iran is effective and that the US has beaten Iran militarily. On the other hand, you have reports that the war is costing billions, US energy prices remain elevated, and global markets are still absorbing the shock. That disconnect is what makes this whole news cycle so unstable. There's also a deeper issue here that doesn't get enough attention in the mainstream coverage. Washington keeps acting as though every foreign policy problem can be solved by force, sanctions, or leverage, but those tools have real limits. Sometimes they work, sometimes they create blowback, and sometimes they just leave the United States holding the cost while somebody else holds the narrative. If you're an average American, you should care less about the media drama around strong leadership and more about whether your life is getting more expensive because of these decisions. That's not isolationism, that's basic accountability. Now for one of the strangest headlines in the mix. Venezuela's acting president publicly rejecting Trump's comments about the country becoming the 51st state. That alone sounds like political fever, but it sits on top of a very real territorial dispute over Essequibo, a resource-rich region claimed by both Venezuela and Guyana. The broader point here is that energy and territory are still driving global politics just as much as ideology. Essequibo sits near major oil deposits, and that makes the dispute much bigger than a border argument on paper. The reporting says Venezuela is arguing its case at the International Court of Justice, while Guyana says the land dispute threatens its sovereignty. Meanwhile, Trump is making comments that sound provocative even by modern standards, including talk about Canada and Venezuela in the same breath. Now, to be fair, some of the reporting around this story reads like it is trying very hard to make the geopolitical chaos sound normal. That's a problem. When headlines drift too far into personality politics, the actual stakes can get lost. And the stakes are real: sovereignty, energy, legal authority, and regional stability. What's notable is how quickly these issues turn into a larger pattern. Whether it's Gaza, Iran, or Venezuela, the same themes keep showing up: borders, resources, force, and the assumption that pressure solves everything. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it does, creates a bigger mess with a higher price tag. Here's the big picture. First, the Gaza ceasefire is clearly not holding in any meaningful way if strikes are still killing civilians and aid remains restricted. Second, the Iran war is no longer just a military story. It is becoming an economic story, and Americans are already feeling it through higher energy costs and a ballooning bill. Third, Trump's trip to China is really about managing overlap: trade, war, and global leverage all at once. And fourth, the Venezuela story reminds us that resource politics and sovereignty disputes are never far from the surface. The common thread is simple. The headlines are different, but the underlying problem is the same. Power is being used everywhere, and the costs are rarely paid by the people making the decisions. If you want more straightforward breakdowns of the news without the hype, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment with which story you think matters most right now: Gaza, Iran, China, or Venezuela. And if you want, I can also turn this into a tighter news desk version, a more dramatic commentary style, or a fully narrated script with stronger hooks and punchier transitions.